We have a special guest speaker today. We have Jonathan, who's tuning in from Singapore. In terms of his background, he's been a MBA coach for a couple of decades now. Globally, one of the most qualified people to guide you on Stanford, Harvard, and other top MBA programs, which he will talk about in more detail.
So the first one, we had one thing we really wanted to look at is number one, he was a Singapore scholar. So just to give you some context, Singapore is extremely known to excel in attracting talents into Singapore for education. So they go overseas, like in the Southeast Asia region, including China, and they basically organize exams. So they pick the best of the best, bring them in, and bond them for a few years. So they have to do university, and then they have to stay to work 3, 4, 5, 6 years, depending on the length and the importance of the grant they receive. We really wanted to show that him starting his career in the oil and gas industry was not something that was passive. I mean, most chemical engineers in, I would say, like a fairly regional hub with a lot of oil and gas tend to end up in oil and gas. And when you make your career choice passive, you're losing points. So what we wanted to do is make his career choice active. We wanted to show that he chose to start his career in the oil and gas industry. But basically, it's always about tying up what you've done with your long-term goal and how to best basically pick the short-term goal that makes the most sense in that angle. So in his case, it was about, clean energy. It was about really moving into starting his own VC fund. But I think the last point that we really used, and not that we use it a lot, it's not like, oh, LGBTQ, and I use it every single time. But in his case, we've used it, but not just to tell him that he was LGBTQ. We used it because, think about this, in the context of the oil and gas industry, a very mature industry, it's not that simple to come out. And he was very active in the DEI of his company. And as a matter of fact, the day or the week he submitted his application for HBS, there was a global video release where he was a big part of it for his company. So we wanted to use that to basically showcase a level of courage that basically could show the admission committee that that person was going to really achieve greater outcome in the future because he was courageous. So that's the elements we've used for that gentleman to help him get into HBS. Let's call him Harvard. Harvard was such a great chap. I mean, he's one of those persons, we remain friends until today. I really enjoyed working with him. But remember, he came to me. He had a very good career. He had a very, very good job back then. He left a lot of money on the table, as a matter of fact, to pursue his MBA. And he came to me with the goal of doing an EMBA back then, right? And, I think there was a dream for him to move to the US. But think of this, he was a VP for a big tech company, had a wife, still has a wife, 2 kids. So it was a massive move. But when we look at the profile was interesting. Obviously I saw a lot of value, because he had, a great career of 7 years in finance and then pivoting to tech, was building a business for a fairly massive tech company in the region. On paper, it was good. But then, obviously, when you start working with the applicant, you start to get to know a lot about them. And I think, the key element in his story was he came from a very, lower middle class family in India. Typical low middle class, nothing really terrible, but far from being a nice life when you're a teenager, child. He got his job offer recently. The job offer he got the year before, doing placement. God, so he found himself working in Rajasthan in a factory at 40 degrees heat, it was a horrible job. But within 6 to 8 weeks, was able to basically relentlessly apply to a new job and got himself into a top investment bank, and from then to another investment bank, and from then from Mumbai to Singapore, continued his career in finance, a lot of deals, moved to private equity, and then moved into tech. So we had a great story. We were able to create a story of resilience, a story of finance and building businesses. And he had a very clear vision. This one is not a vision we define. It's a vision where the applicant basically came to us with a clear vision and we just refine it. There's a difference between defining and refining. So here's the thing. Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world, and yet 90% at least of Indonesian MBA applicants are going to be Indonesian Chinese, right? So when you're an Indonesian Muslim woman, you're a minority despite being from the majority. So we've used that. The first thing I was hey, that's something we need to use. Second thing is she had already operated 2 pivots in her career. She started in banking, moved into tech, and then went into VC. Now, the story is this. That person called me December, months before the deadline, Her dream school was water. She was like, hey, can you get me into water? So, we spent an hour and a half discussing, ask her questions. And at the end of the call, I was like, hey, you know what? Let's drop water and let's apply Harvard Stanford. We kept water as a backup. So basically, she was the first to have invested in a fishery that became like one of the most famous investments in Southeast Asia, and like that made, I think, a 70x for a VC fund. And the way she was describing her success is like this. She told me, hey, you know what, John? The reason I'm good in my job is not because I'm the smartest, but all of my colleagues went to very good school overseas, come from very good families, and don't understand Indonesian middle class pain points. Me, I come from tier 2 cities in the countryside. I live in Jakarta. Yes, I have a good job, but I don't earn as much because we're still in Indonesia. And I understand the pain points of the middle class in Indonesia. So I see investments that my colleagues, very well educated overseas, who come from good families, cannot see. And that's the storyline we've ran for Harvard. I think what we really played here was a passion for the public sector and the public good. She was really passionate about the development of the region, especially with back then the Saudi Vision 2030 and everything that was happening back then. So she was very involved, especially in her job with the consulting firm. Most of the engagement she was working on for the past 3 years were in the public sector. And she also had experience as a startup founder and advising a family business that was not too small, fairly prominent. So we also had a lot of entrepreneurship hands-on experience. And what we used there was a bit of a cliche, I would say, but that works. It was about empowerment, it was about women empowerment, education, all in line with of course the vision around MBA's vision about Saudi 2030. So everything was very much believable. And I think that's how we got someone who had, I would say, on paper, maybe not the most impressive experience. I can give you profiles that were 30 times more impressive, more years of experience, more entrepreneurship, more this, more that. But when you look at the whole package, the story was really compelling because from a young age, she was very much involved in promoting education. And she had always been consistent about this. One of the theses she wrote in college was about education in the Middle East and how technology could basically improve it. So we had a lot of content around this to support her. When it came to me, I look at his profile, his CV was very poorly written, very engineering focused. I look at his profile and it was kind of inside. I was okay, inside, I think we can make it, right? Because you're young, but I think we have a shot. But once we started to rewrite the CV, we started to realize there was a couple of good things in it. So number one, the first year of his career was bad, but he graduated at the peak of the COVID pandemic. So there was a bit of the job market wasn't very amazing back then. But then he was able to pivot quickly and join one of the most prestigious relation programs globally. They take so little people that it's extremely hard to get in, right? He was also a global, top 7 IB scorers. So we overplayed a bit the academics for him initially. I think it does leave an impression to tell people, hey, I'm a global 7 top IB scorer, right? It's kind of prestigious to say. So basically, we've used that, the academic, the career, and in his job, he was managing plants. He was managing, as a matter of fact, he was managing a factory, right? It was a rotation program. Yeah, he had 300 people under him. So very young, but with a very high level of responsibilities. And as I said, I think the one thing we really also leveraged was the upbringing across 3 continents, and the time he spent in the Middle East, in Oman, was a big part of his story for Harvard, during his years, and how it opened his mind to other culture and so on. We played everything we could on his hand. Oil and gas, obviously, is always going to be about the clean tech. Right, long term, I want to change the world. I want to improve access to clean energy and so on. But his subject matter expertise was really about supply chain in his companies. So what we decided to do was basically to really tie it back. So his long-term goal was to start a small consulting firm that basically was going to specialize on advising companies on optimizing their supply chain, with 2 goals. One is, of course, reducing the environmental cost of the supply chain. And 2 was to also get better access to clean energy, because apparently the main challenge for clean energy is the supply chain of them.
Perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.